There are moments in history that no camera captures, no journalist records, no publicist manages. They happen in the spaces between the things the world is watching, in hallways, in parking lots, in rooms that were supposed to be empty. This is one of those moments. It was 1970. New York City carried its weight the way it always had, concrete and exhaust, and the particular electricity of 10 million people brushing against each other without ever truly touching. The music industry lived inside that friction. Studios ran day and night. Engineers slept in booths. Artists came and went through unmarked doors, because marked doors meant photographers, and photographers meant everything that came with them. Bob Dylan had been recording at Columbia Recording Studios on West 52nd Street for weeks. Not steadily. Dylan rarely did anything steadily during this period. He worked in bursts, arriving without warning, filling tape with raw takes, then vanishing again just as suddenly. His producer knew better than to ask where he went when he left. The session notes from those weeks are sparse, full of gaps. One evening in particular stands out for what it does not record. Dylan left the studio at approximately 9 in the evening. He had finished what he needed to finish for that night. The assistant engineer locked up the control room. 2 session musicians gathered their cases. The building did not fully empty. It never did. But Studio E, the smaller of the 2 main rooms, was left dark and unlocked, in the way that rooms sometimes are, when everyone believes someone else was the last to leave. Jim Morrison was in New York that week. He was not there for any particular reason that anyone could pin down later. The Doors had no scheduled sessions in the city. There was no promotional obligation, no interview, no performance. He had simply arrived, the way Morrison sometimes arrived in places as if the geography of the moment had pulled him there, before his conscious mind had agreed to the journey. He was 26 years old. He had already lived several lifetimes inside that number. The people who were around him during this period speak carefully when they describe what he was like, not with the reverence of mythology. He had enough of that already, and he knew it, and it troubled him in ways he couldn't always articulate. They speak carefully because what they are describing is not easy to name. He was brilliant and exhausted in equal measure. He was a man whose public self had grown so large that the private self was beginning to struggle to find air. He wrote constantly notebooks, napkins, margins of whatever was near, because writing was the one place where the 2 selves could still negotiate honestly. That evening, someone who knew someone brought him to West 52nd Street. The details of how he came to be inside Studio E are not entirely clear. What is clear is that he was there, alone, sometime after Dylan had left, and before the building's night staff made their rounds. The room was dark, except for the standby light on the mixing board, that faint amber glow that recording studios always carry. The color of something that has been warm and is cooling but has not yet gone cold. He sat at the piano bench, not at the piano itself beside it, facing the room rather than the keys. And here, the story enters the territory that is hardest to tell, because what follows happened in silence, witnessed by no one, and was only discovered afterward. But what was discovered matters. Because Jim Morrison, in that room, in the dark, took out one of his notebooks. And he wrote. To understand what those pages meant, it helps to understand what Bob Dylan's studio represented to Jim Morrison in 1970. Not what it represented publicly. That is a simpler story, full of the usual landmarks. Dylan had rewritten what a song could carry. Morrison knew this. Every serious songwriter of that generation knew this. Dylan had proven that a lyric could hold philosophical weight, could be simultaneously cryptic and devastatingly personal. could speak to millions while remaining essentially private. But Morrison's relationship to Dylan's work was more complicated than admiration. It was the complicated feeling of a writer who recognizes in another writer something that he himself has been reaching for and has not yet fully caught. Morrison had been called a poet by people who meant it as a compliment, and he had accepted the designation with a guarded pride. But Dylan had been called a poet and had somehow managed to make the word feel accurate rather than promotional. Morrison carried that distinction with him. He carried it the way certain people carry a question they can't stop asking.
What was he really after?
Not the crowd. He had the crowd. Not the noise, he had more of that than he knew what to do with. What he was after was harder to name. It had something to do with permanence. Not fame, he was already famous enough that fame had ceased to feel real. Something else. The sense that the words he was putting into the world were going somewhere that mattered, that they would outlast the performance, that they would remain when the leather and the stage lights and the mythology had all burned away. He sat in Dylan's room, and he wrote about that. Not directly. He was never direct in the way that journalists wished he would be. He wrote around it, through it, in images that circled the thing without landing on it. A man standing in a field after a storm, looking at where the lightning had struck. The shape of a sound after it has stopped. The particular quality of a room that has held music, and now holds only the memory of music. He wrote about his father. This was rare. Morrison's relationship with his father, a Navy admiral, a man of strict discipline and institutional authority, was one of the defining silences of his life. He had built an entire public persona, partly in opposition to that silence. The rebellion was genuine, but rebellion is not the same as resolution, and Morrison knew the difference, even when he couldn't speak it aloud. In that room, in the dark, he wrote it. Not in a way that resolved anything. They are not a peace treaty. They are something more honest than that, the record of a man trying to see clearly, without the armor of performance, the shape of something he had been carrying for years without fully looking at. He wrote about the stage. This is perhaps the most striking thing in those pages, because Morrison's relationship to performance was the central fact of his public life, and yet he had rarely written about it in a way that was this unguarded. He wrote about what it felt like in the moments before the lights came up, not the anticipation that audiences imagined, not the electric readiness that his stage persona projected, but something quieter and stranger, a kind of grief, the grief of a man who knows that what is about to happen will be extraordinary and public, and will leave him, afterward, more alone than he was before. He wrote, "The crowd gives and takes in the same motion, and you cannot explain to anyone what it costs to stand in the center of that exchange." He wrote about Dylan without naming him. He wrote about the difference between a voice that commands and a voice that confesses, and which of the two had the longer life. He had built his career on command, but in the notebooks, in private, he kept returning to confession, to the question of whether the songs that would last were the ones that demanded or the ones that surrendered. He did not answer the question, but he kept asking it in different words, across those pages, in a room that belonged to someone else, in the dark. The pages were found the next morning. Not dramatically. An assistant engineer came in early to prep the room for a session scheduled for 10 o'clock, and there on the piano bench was a notebook, open, left behind. The handwriting was recognizable to anyone who knew Morrison's work. He wrote, in a fast, looping hand that leaned hard to the right as if always moving forward. The assistant did not read it carefully. He set it aside. He assumed it belonged to someone on the session roster and would be claimed. It was not claimed that day, or the next. When it eventually made its way back into the orbit of people who recognized it for what it was, Dylan was informed that something had been left in the studio after his session. What he was told about the contents and what he thought about them is not a matter of public record. Dylan has always been careful about what he makes public record. What is known is that he did not return the notebook through any official channel. It moved through informal hands, the way things moved in that world, and eventually settled where such things settle out of sight, preserved, belonging to a moment that had already passed. But the words remained. And the question Morrison had been asking in that room, the question about command versus confession, that question did not stay in the notebook. It lived in the work he made in the months that followed. Something had shifted, slightly but genuinely. Something had been looked at directly that had previously only been circled. It is worth pausing here to say something about what Jim Morrison was, beyond the mythology. He was 26 years old in 1970. He had been performing at the highest level for 4 years. He had written songs that millions of people carried inside them as if they were personal memories. He was not the sum of his mythology. He was a person, specific and complex, capable of embarrassment and tenderness and genuine intellectual curiosity, and all of those things were present in those pages. What he left behind in that studio was not a masterpiece. It was not meant to be. It was a man thinking, honestly, without an audience, in a room that had held the work of someone he respected. That is, perhaps, its own kind of masterpiece. Because the question he kept returning to, what does it cost to stand in the center of the exchange, is not only a question about rock music or performance, or even art. It is a question about what it means to give yourself to something that cannot give itself back. It is a question about the particular loneliness of being understood by many people and known by very few. Morrison knew it from the inside. Dylan knew it from the inside. They never spoke about it directly, as far as anyone can confirm. They occupied the same spaces at different times, and the spaces held what they left there. There is a photograph of Jim Morrison taken sometime in 1970 that captures something the concert photographs rarely do. He is not performing. He is sitting somewhere quiet, looking at something outside the frame. His expression is not the face the stage knew. What is there instead is harder to name. It looks, for lack of a better word, like attention, like a man genuinely trying to see something. That is the face of the man who sat in Bob Dylan's studio in the dark and wrote what he wrote. Not the Lizard King, not the shaman, just a young man with a notebook and a question he couldn't stop asking. He left the notebook on the bench and walked out into the city. He had a little over a year left. He spent it writing. What does it mean that this happened? It means that the songs were never only performances. They were the overflow of something much quieter, a private reckoning that never fully resolved, that kept producing new pages, new questions, new attempts to see clearly. It means that Bob Dylan's studio was, for one night, a room where two of the most significant voices of a generation were present, though only one of them knew it. The room held both of them in its walls, in its air, in the faint amber glow of its standby light. Morrison walked back out into New York. The city absorbed him the way it always did. Nobody on the street knew what had just happened in that room. The walls of Studio E remembered. And now, reading those pages the way they circle and reach and fall short, and keep trying, you remember too. That is what he left behind. Not a masterpiece, not a resolution, just the truth of what it cost. And the truth, as Morrison always suspected, turns out to be more than enough.